All right. Good afternoon, all, and to those that watch this later, I guess. So thanks for sort of joining in and on Friday afternoon. And what I wanted to do today, so I'll kind of get straight to the point. What I wanted to do today is continue talking a little bit about foreign direct investment and try to connect a few dots that that I think ought to make a little bit of sense to you, even going back to thinking about our discussions of trade politics and trade policy. But what I want to start with, if I can, is I'm going to see if I can share my screen. No, 1 second. Let me just give me 1 second to get it. There we go. What I want to show you is something from, I want to start by showing you, I guess, some examples of what I was talking about very briefly, because some of you may not have appreciated or believed what I said at the end of the last session. We were talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly of foreign direct investment. And that in the sense that when we talk about capital flows, one of the big problems has been in the post-war period has been getting some of that capital from the especially private capital, private held mostly in private hands, multinationals, not the sort of the development capital that we think about from the IMF or from state development agencies, but rather private capital. How do we get private capital to flow from those who have it, which is largely rich country multinationals, to those that do not and those that need it? In a sense, you can almost think about this as a bit of a market failure, because when you think about the the supply and demand and the price of capital, you would think that it would flow from a place of abundance where it would be really cheap to a place of scarcity where it could earn a much higher rate of return. But the challenge with foreign direct investment is that it hasn't actually done that. It doesn't do that naturally. It's almost like a market failure, and you can blame a whole range of things that we'll talk about here again in just a minute in the context of the good, the bad, and the ugly. But you can think of it as a market failure that is in a sense a byproduct of sovereignty almost. But let me just sort of set the scene here, and I'll show you some stats very quickly that I think will drive home this message about the cleavage between the rich country multinationals that hold a lot of this capital and those that are trying to get it, and some of the international institutions that have been put in place to try to change that incentive structure. All right. So this, what you're looking at here, I hope you're seeing, something that says key messages, right? I hope it says, this is from the United Nations. It is the World Investment Report. Yes, there is one. It's like almost 300 pages in length. So good bedtime reading for all of you, the insomniacs. But it depicts every year a kind of similar story. And it is one that I've just described to you in terms of this disparities in capital flows between rich countries and poor countries. So rich countries have all the capital, poor countries tend to struggle to get it. But this report, in addition to talking about the 2019 sort of situation, lays out some pretty grim scenarios for 2020 and the impact of COVID on capital flows, particularly in the developing world. Because at the same time, you're seeing all these lockdowns, you're also seeing some pretty strong disincentives to follow through on a lot of major investment projects that would have taken place in the developing countries. And so you can see this, highlighted. I got a bunch of highlighted things here. Lockdown measures are slowing, disincentivizing lots of investment projects. And then on top of that, you're also seeing the same kind of economic nationalism we saw or have seen in trade policy filtering in to investment policy. And by that, I mean, there's a lot of national security reviews. Many of you would be familiar with, the Chinese investment in oil sands in Alberta, and this caused a big kerfuffle over the last several years. Oh my goodness, this is terrible. Those investments from abroad are often subjected to national security reviews. So prior to an acquisition by a foreign entity, foreign capital coming in, the state will often intervene and review and decide whether that investment can take place because of national security concerns and so on. There are more of those measures being put in place all over the world, disincentivizing even further investment. But just let me give you a sense for some of the forecasts for the coming year. Foreign direct investment flows to Africa are forecast to fall by 25 to 40% in 2020, as largely as a result of COVID. Flows to developing Asia are similarly expected to fall between 30 and 45% over the next by the time this report comes out in 2020. Latin America and the Caribbean, FDI is expected to halve, so be cut in half throughout the in the coming year. And economies, FDI flows to economies in transition are expected to fall by between 30 and 45%. And so this is not even including the least developed and the most vulnerable countries, which are expected to be hit even harder. And so I want to show you just how big the disparities are by looking at some of these, at some stats that I have highlighted down here below. I have to scroll down, apologies. Got them highlighted here. Give me one second. Okay, here we go. All right, so this table 1.4, which I hope y'all can see, is FDI flows by region in the 2 years 2017 to 2019. And what I want you to note here, and I've got highlighted in yellow that I hope you can see, developed economies and developing economies. And just look at the sheer volume. So you got in 2017, for example, FDI inflows, you have $1.7 trillion worth of FDI inflows. 950 billion of that are accounted for by just two regions, North America and Europe. And it reemphasizes my point from last time that most capital flows take place between rich countries, the majority. Now, developing economies, especially in East Asia, are accounting for a growing share of overall FDI flows. But even in 2019, you can see that there's a tremendous disparity. And when you get down even further and you look at some of these structurally weak or vulnerable economies, how little foreign direct investment flows to them. And so one of the big challenges on this has been in terms of the international community thinking about development is how do you get some of that private capital to come your way? If you are the leader of a developing country and you're thinking about, wow, look at this big disparity, look at all this money that's flowing around in the developed North, how can I get some of that? How can I get some of that to, and I'm going to share something different here. How can I get a bit of that capital? Share a different screen here. How can I get a bit of that capital to come my way? So when you think again about the good, the bad, and the ugly, if you are a developing country, you want some of the capital formation that comes from private capital flows into your country. You want all of the skill enhancing technology transfers that can come from the know-how of a multinational that brings its capital into your country. You want the higher wage rates that multinationals tend to pay, right? You want some of that competitive sort of fire, I guess you might say, that multinationals might bring to the table. And you like all this increased competition, the sort of the increased product quality. You want all that stuff, right? But the problem is that you don't get enough spin-offs. The costs to the local firms sometimes are a little onerous. And you have this general loss of policy sovereignty. And what do I mean by that? Well, when you think about property rights in, say, Canada, right, the state say the city wants to expand the LRT and they want to put it through your backyard, they can do that. It's eminent domain, they call it. The state has the ability to come and take your property, but under Canadian law, under sovereign Canadian law, you have a right to be compensated for that expropriation. So if the city wants to build the LRT through your backyard, okay, great. You're going to get paid. You're going to get a paycheck or a check for the value of that land in your backyard and the disruption. You can hold out. You can go to court over that, right? I can't show it here, but if any of you want to go to Google Earth, the best example of this, if you go to Google Earth, type in Narita Airport, Narita International Airport in outside Tokyo, and look at the runways. And one of the runways is perfectly good length. Another one seems a bit short, and there seems to be a lot of taxiways around it. And if you look, if you scroll down and there's a farm right in the middle of the airport. And it's because a farm owner, a landowner, decided to hold out and refuse to sell to the developers of that airport. He stuck his heels in the ground and said, I'm not selling. And so now he's totally surrounded by airport taxiways and so on. It's really bizarre looking. But that is an example of where the state cannot come and expropriate your property without due process. The farmer said, hey, I'm not getting enough for my land for you to build this runway that's going to make you lots of money over the years. And so he stayed there for the longest time. But the state has eminent domain in that they can come and expropriate your property, but they have to give you under domestic law some compensation. This doesn't exist in international law. If a company like Siemens plops its factory down into a developing country offers wants all the good from foreign direct investment. But then what's to stop the state from rolling the tanks up to the gate of that new factory and saying, thank you very much for building that, now get lost? What recourse does Siemens have in that context? They do not have the same rights under international law that you do to fight the city's ability to build the LRT through the backyard, all right? And so nationalization and expropriation, the sovereign powers of the state, are a major disincentive for those capital flows to go from the rich multinationals in the north that hold them to the poorer jurisdictions that want them. And so the local rule of law, the stability of property rights, is one set of issues that is a disincentive for the flow of that capital from the largely developed rich north. And it's a simplicity, that's an oversimplification, but it's a set of disincentives for the transfer of some of that capital from the rich developed north to the south. Okay, so the sovereign power of the state is a big deal. If you look at what's happened to the oil and gas sector in Venezuela over the last 10 or 15 years, expropriation has been a big problem, a big challenge. Many multinationals, ExxonMobil, BP, others, have been kicked out of Venezuela and their property has been expropriated by the state, okay? Now you could say, well, the state should have the power to do this, and there's a lot of debate around that. But if you read my piece on E-Class about North America and the Chapter 11 of the NAFTA, you will see I repeat some of what I've just told you now. There's a kind of historical post-war effort to bring about rules that would, in a sense, tie private multinationals to some kind of legal apparatus that would allow them some recourse in the event that there was expropriation. Under international law, the multinational corporation is actually quite weak legally. It doesn't have any recourse. There's no court that a multinational can go to and complain to about the fact that their property just got expropriated. You and I, in a domestic setting, we can go to court and we can fight the city and we can get better compensation, or we can deny the city the right to put the LRT through the backyard. But a multinational is actually quite weak, in a quite weak legal position because of the role of sovereignty. Okay, so that's the big point I think that's the biggest hurdle to some of that private capital moving into developing countries. There are obviously others. So for example, the rule of law is a big deal, but do you have access to a skilled labor force? What kind of infrastructure are you going to be able to operate within? Good transportation linkages and so on. There's a whole host of other issues. Maybe does the workforce have access to healthcare and so on? So there's a whole panoply of other issues. But when we're thinking about the legal regimes, the international legal regimes around foreign direct investment, this is one of the big things that we're talking about. And what you'll read in my piece is that over the course of the post-war period, there have been a whole series of institutions. Are you seeing, can somebody tell me, are you seeing NAFTA in chapter 11? Yes, okay, good. This is just a series of notes. I'm not going to go through them at great length, but they're posted on eClass under foreign direct investment and international and corporate social responsibility. I think it's week 8. But it just talks about the post-war evolution of this set of rules and norms governing the flows of foreign direct investment, binding the sovereign state to private holders of capital, putting in place institutions, and in particular, arbitration bodies to adjudicate in the event of a form of expropriation, giving the private multinational, in a sense, the same rights that you and I do to challenge the city and its choice or decision to build an LRT extension in our backyard. Okay, tremendously controversial over the last 10 or 15 years. Civil society has gone nuts over this stuff because they argue that this has given too much power to multinationals and taken too much power away from the sovereign state. All of these rules that have been put in place. And so my piece goes through a lot of that. I don't normally flag my piece, but I think it's a heck of a good piece. And so I wanted to draw your attention to it because there has been a kind of lattice work of international rules, everything from bilateral investment treaties to investment provisions within multilateral agreements or regional agreements like the NAFTA. But there is no global body that adjudicates these flows of capital between private multinationals, private capital flowing into developing states. But as I argued earlier, one of the reasons not much of it does flow to developing states is partly because of the absence, the relative absence of a legal framework by which that capital can flow into to those sovereign countries. Okay. With that, I want to stop for just a second and see if anyone has any kind of comments or questions about that. Thoughts? No. Okay, good. All right. I think that's what I wanted to do on the World Investment Report. Okay, one other thing on investment that I want to try and do very quickly, and I think is worth doing now, is talk about, so, I sent you a piece from the Wall Street Journal today, written by Douglas Irwin, good piece. And one of the points he makes is something that I tried to make a few weeks ago, which is that you cannot solve your balance of payments problems via trade policy. And I want to connect this to our discussion of investment or capital flows for just a second, okay? I want to come back to the idea of balance of payments. I'm going to use my little whiteboard here for just a second. And remember we had our sort of national checkbook, okay? And we talked about this was basically trade policy. And this was flows of capital over here, the capital account. Let me make that better. Okay. What happens, and this is, I'm trying to describe or explain Irwin or try to even say something about how capital flows can be destabilizing in certain contexts. Imagine you have a major capital inflow, right? So I'll put a major capital inflow onto the capital account, okay? Major infusion of capital, whether you're a developing country, rich country, doesn't matter. Imagine you have a major capital inflow into your country, right? If you follow this little equation, what has to happen on the other side? You inherently, this is balance of payments stuff, you inherently have to have a debit on the current account. If you have a positive inflow of capital, like a sudden infusion of capital, say a natural resources boom or something like that, it by definition means you have to have a deficit on the current account. What does that mean? If this is basically trade, it means you're going to have a trade deficit by definition. Okay? If you think about the US situation for just a second, United States not only has lots of capital flows, private capital flows flowing into it all the time, but it also borrows from abroad. It's a constant flow, positive credit on the capital account. By definition, you're going to have the United States over-consuming and having a trade deficit by definition. So when Donald Trump, and this is Irwin's point, when Donald Trump, this is the situation for the United States, by the way, right? It has a serious current account deficit, a capital account surplus. When Douglas Irwin talks about Donald Trump's failures and his failure to deal with trade policy or a trade deficit using trade policy, and he says it's actually a macroeconomic problem, this is what he's talking about. As long as the United States continues to borrow extensively from abroad, have capital flows in, it's going to have a capital account surplus. By definition, it has to have a current account deficit. It's never going to deal with this problem through trade policy. You can't. You have to deal with this problem. If you really want to attack America's trade deficit, its current account deficit, America has to stop borrowing so much from abroad, has to start saving more money. So the futility, and this is the point of Irwin's piece, the futility of Donald Trump's trade policy, trying to deal with the trade deficit through trade policy, tariffs, kind of trade policy nationalism, is futile because you're not dealing with this fundamental problem. In a sense, as long as America keeps borrowing so much from abroad and has a consistent capital account surplus because it's borrowing so much from abroad, it is always going to have this problem over here. And so somebody should get to Donald Trump and give him a little lesson in macroeconomics, because you cannot deal with a trade deficit by tackling or using trade policy. You have to do this. You have to tackle it on the other side. It's a macroeconomic, it's the nation's entire checkbook. The United States is consuming way more than it earns from abroad, and it's borrowing to do that. And so you inherently have this situation. And so that's the point that Irwin is making in that piece. And that's why I sent it to you, because we dealt with this very quickly a few days ago. If you think about this in terms of the destabilizing nature, remember we were talking about Alan Blinder the other day and his prescriptions for a new financial architecture. And one of his ideas was to have a kind of Tobin tax, a kind of timeout. Don't liberalize your capital account so quickly. Don't allow so much capital to flow in so freely, and certainly don't allow it to exit so quickly. Because what happens when you are, if you think about the inflow of capital to a developing country, right? And you think about this in terms even of currencies. What happens when foreigners suddenly want to invest in assets that are denominated in your country's currency? What happens to that currency? It bids up the price. Let's see if I can do this here. It bids up the price of your local currency. Foreigners want your currency. They're bringing their currency to your central bank, asking for your currency, bidding up the price, okay? Well, what happens is this. You end up with the same situation where suddenly, because the price of your currency is rising rapidly, because foreigners are investing, say, in your natural resource sector, okay, the price of your currency relative to theirs is rising rapidly. You suddenly have a currency in your pocket that is worth more than it was a few days ago. What's going to happen? You're going to probably buy more imports. You're probably going to buy more from abroad, right? The price of your exports is going to rise because the value of your currency is going up. Okay? So in a sense, a natural resource boom that incentivizes a huge influx of capital appreciates the value of the local currency, makes exports more expensive for foreigners to buy, makes what you used to sell to foreigners more expensive to buy. And you have all of these more highly valued currency units in your pocket that you're going to go out and buy more imports with. So in a sense, this can be, for a rich country, this can be managed over a time period. But if you're thinking about this in the context of a developing country, this can be very destabilizing, especially if all of a sudden you have capital outflows and it reverses and you have capital flowing out. And that's why Blinder was talking about having a kind of timeout, a kind of Tobin tax, a kind of cooling off period when, say, the politics or the sentiment of the market suddenly started to change. Because as soon as you have this reversal and you have capital flowing out, everything changes all of a sudden. Sure, your exports are now going to suddenly be a little cheaper, but your economy is going to be smashed because all of a sudden you can't buy the things from abroad that you used to. Your currency has collapsed in value as capital exits. Foreigners are going to your central bank and saying, please give me my money back. I don't want your domestic currency anymore. I'm out. And so this can be a rapid reversal like that, could be profoundly destabilizing. And as foreigners exit with the central banks, foreign reserves, foreigners, they've committed to paying those that present that currency. That can be very destabilizing, and those that left behind are in deep, deep trouble. Okay, so I wanted to say just a couple of things about that because I think that's worth revisiting. Balance of payments and this idea of capital flows. What happens to the currency and what happens to your trade balance as you have capital flowing in or out? What is the incentive? What's the incentive structure? What's likely to happen to the value of that currency? And what does it mean for, say, your export balance and your current account? And I would do this on a big giant board face to face, but I hope that brings at least a tiny bit of clarity because that's also in some of the notes that that are posted and that we've talked a little bit about on eClass. Okay, so just wanted to run through that for just a second. Any questions or thoughts about that or complaints before I move on and just say a few things about corporate social responsibility? Okay, yeah, that's what I wanted to know. Okay, so CSR. Let me see if I can. So in eClass, there are a series of articles that I want to jump up and down about and suggest that you read. Two of them are right here in The Economist. One is called The Good Company, and these seem dated, but I want to make a specific point about these two pieces. Look at the dates. One is January 2005. The other one is January 2008. It's only 3 short years. And what I want to say about these, they're really good pieces, and I've highlighted some of the, in yellow, some of the important stuff to take a look at. But I recommend both of those pieces. Just give them a quick skim, because I'm going to give you the punchline here. The piece in 2005 talked about corporate social responsibility in terms of theft. They described it as theft. What do they mean by that? What do they mean by a company that engages in in sort of socially responsible activities, whether it's around environment or around nonprofits or tries to become a more sustainable entity? What does The Economist mean by arguing that that kind of expenditure is theft? Well, what they're arguing is that they're taking shareholder dividends, shareholder profits, and they're diverting them away from what the company's primary responsibility. The only point of a company is to make money for its shareholders, make money for its investors. It's a very narrow definition of what a multinational corporation is supposed to do. And they argue that any diversion of, profits, dividends to shareholders is to some corporate social responsibility, some socially achievable goals, is in effect theft from the shareholders. In a sense, they're dismissing all of this idea that companies should be engaged in any kind of socially responsible kinds of goals, dealing with, say the local community, contributing to the activities of nonprofits, you name it. It's a whole host of things. And in 2005, they argued that that is theft, that is a diversion, an artificial diversion away from profits that belong in the hands of shareholders. Okay. Now, from the perch of 2020, we say, wow, that's a pretty harsh kind of assessment. What I want to point out is that if you go to the very next piece from January 2008, just 3 years later, The Economist takes a totally different approach to everything. And they not only argue that, they stop arguing that it's theft, and they actually start to argue that corporate social responsibility activities have become good business, meaning that companies, to their detriment, fail to appeal to the social proclivities of you and I, the social preferences of you and I, the responsibility to the environment, to the community that we now take as accepted wisdom that a company should have. No company can exist in some sort of isolated bubble. It exists as part of a community, and it has responsibilities to that community. And what they argue, in just 3 short years, they go from a very purely kind of capitalist interpretation of what the role of the firm is to saying that the firm actually has a social responsibility, and on top of that, that it's good business to do that. That appealing to our sense of social justice, for example, is an important part of any business model. Any sustainable business model needs those elements in order for that business to survive, in order to preserve shareholder value. Okay? So what accounts for that change in just 3 years? Is it just, they fired all the old people that wrote for The Economist and got new ones? No, it's in part us. When we go, for example, when we go to the grocery store, do we, or to the, go shopping anywhere, shop online, I pay a little more attention than I did 10 years ago to how much packaging, something I'm going to purchase actually contains. Is it recycled material? Many of you probably buy fair trade coffee, because you think you're willing to pay a little bit of extra money to ensure that the coffee is harvested in a sustainable way with sustainable wages, and is not undermining the environment, for example. Okay, we've all adopted some of these norms of behavior, these norms around and expectations around corporate social responsibility. And what's remarkable, and this is the point, is that in just 3 short years, it went from being argued that that kind of activity was theft and a diversion of profits to really no end, to no purposeful good, to saying, wait a minute, this is now incredibly good business. And so what I want to point you, I'll invite you to take a look at a bunch of these things, but I have here linked a bunch of firms, like the Body Shop, NEI Investments, Carbon Zero. I invite you to click on them yourselves over the next, however many days, whenever, and just note and go to any company's website, any multinational firm's website, go to airlines, oil companies, you name it, and notice how quickly you can find their corporate social responsibility tab, their commitment to corporate social responsibility, their commitment to the environment. It's front and center as part of their business model. And the argument that The Economist makes in '08 is that this is in part in response to our preferences as consumers. We have had an impact on their business model and their willingness and their sense of obligation to respond to our social preferences, our preferences around social justice issues, for example. The Body Shop was arguably out in front on this, where they banned the testing of all of their cosmetics on animals way before anybody else did. They, in a sense, led the wave into the bans on animal testing that a lot of the other, big cosmetics firms, L'Oreal. I'm going to test my knowledge of all. I should know this better, but the big cosmetics firms, the based in Paris, Chanel and all of these others that still sometimes do animal testing. Body Shop has led the way on all of that. NEI Investments is really interesting too, because now you can purchase mutual funds that are socially responsible. If you want to invest in the stock market and do so in companies that are engaged, that meet certain corporate social responsibility criteria, you can now have mutual funds packaged to meet your tastes. And so we're seeing a response even in finance in terms of demands from us as consumers around what those firms are that we are investing in are actually doing in their activities. You can buy, for example, you can ensure that your personal investments are not being invested in, in private prisons, right? In these corporations that run private prisons in the United States. You can specifically organize a mutual fund that strips out those kinds of companies as part of your investment portfolio. In a sense, rewarding or punishing firms for engaging in activities that are not conducive to our sense of social justice. We can go to the grocery store and we can go down, and I challenge you all to do this, go down the tuna fish, where all the tuna fish, cans of tuna fish are, and look on the cans and you will see dolphin safe labels on a lot of them. So do you purchase that for a few cents more to make sure that dolphins escaped, from the harvesting of tuna in the oceans and weren't captured in the production of those tuna cans? Or do you buy something, the cut rate stuff, that doesn't certify that it was harvested in a sustainable way? Many of us are purchasing things partly on the basis of that sustainability these days. Recycled packaging, sustainably farmed, perhaps farming that is done in a much more environmentally sensitive way. The biggest firm on that I would point to is Chipotle. I'll let you, I won't try to show these here, but I have two advertisements from Chipotle there. One is called The Scientist, the other one is called The Scarecrow. The Scientist is about 1.5 minutes long, and it is Willie Nelson sort of singing the lyrics from the Coldplay song tune, The Scientist. And it's an animated advertisement from Chipotle, which is the American kind of Tex-Mex fast food chains. Very, very good, by the way. But what both of those little advertisements represent is an attack on industrial farming. They are responding as a firm to some of our concerns about the sustainability of large-scale industrial farming. And they're saying to you as consumers, hey, eat at Chipotle because we are about the small craft farmer, the family farmer. We source all of our produce, all of our products from places, from farms that are run in a socially sustainable manner, okay? An environmentally sustainable manner. And so they're very interesting. They're very much out on the cutting edge, trying, as I mentioned a minute ago, trying to orient their entire business model around appealing to people like you who have that greater sense of social responsibility, social justice, climate justice. Firms are responding to that kind of thing in ways that we didn't see 10 or 15 minutes, 10 or 15 minutes, 10 or 15 years ago. And so I invite you to click on those and have a look. They're really quite very, very well done. But again, there's an attack on industrial farming. I also invite you to look at this piece, little documentary on the CBC, The Fifth Estate, about Bangladesh. Some of you may know, if you go to the Superstore, there's this clothing line that they have in there. I think it's called Joe Fresh. It's a clothing line that Superstore has. And in 2013, there was a sweatshop factory in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, that killed roughly 1,100, 1,200 people. The sweatshop pancaked on itself and collapsed. And in the rubble, it turns out that this good Canadian company run by the Loblaws, it's the Weston family from Southern Ontario, and they are always putting forward in their ads these kind of Canadian values, and it's very homey, and shop at Superstore and Loblaws, and we'll provide for your family, and it's all very kind of wholesome, very old school wholesome stuff. Turns out that a lot of their stuff was being made in this factory in Dhaka that killed 1,100 people. And the conditions were horrible. And it was a huge black eye for this Canadian firm because they didn't know that their stuff was being made there. And it drew huge attention to the challenges of supply chains and really forced firms to confront the fact that many of their suppliers, many of their supply chains now, as a result of globalization, are so strung out that we don't know where a lot of the inputs are coming from. And so the Loblaws and the Weston family had no idea that Joe Fresh was being put together, some of the clothing was being put together in this particular factory in Bangladesh. And so it's really forced firms to think hard about how deep into their supply chains they are willing to be or want to be held accountable. Apple has confronted this as well, not only with some of the famous, issues around manufacturing of your little smartphone in China, but also how are the rare earths that go into the components of your phone being mined and taken out of the earth in places like Mongolia? Do we know very much? Does Apple know very much about the working conditions in those mines where those rare earths are extracted and then delivered, transformed into the components that end up in your telephone? And so firms are being asked now, again, because of the pressures of corporate social responsibility, firms are being asked to drill deeper and deeper and have much more oversight into their overall supply chains and the way that they are managed. And so Canadian firms are not immune to this, but you as a consumer, when you think about your new iPhone, what are we on, 12? I think we're on iPhone 12 now, or 13, whatever it is. Do you walk into the Apple store and do you think about how the rare earths in your phone were extracted from a mine in Inner Mongolia and whether or not the miners there received a living wage? Do you think about that? Well, a lot of us probably don't, but some of us do. And it's created a situation where Apple is being pushed to be more transparent about where those rare earths are being sourced. And you can find that on their website as well. If you go to the Apple website, corporate social responsibility is splashed all over their website as well. The last example I'll give you, and then I think that's probably going to be all for today, unless somebody has some questions, is Air Canada and WestJet. You can buy, in the context of purchasing a ticket, so you're going to buy a ticket to fly to Toronto tomorrow, although not very many people are going to do that, but when we can fly again, you can purchase carbon offsets equivalent to the amount of carbon that your bum in that Air Canada seat deposits in the atmosphere on the way to Toronto. You can put in how much you weigh, how far you are going. It knows obviously how far you're going to fly. It knows which airplane you're going to fly on. It will calculate, after you purchase your actual fare, you can stay right on the Air Canada website and have calculated what your contribution sitting on that plane is to the deposit of carbon or greenhouse gases into the atmosphere on your way to Toronto. And you can pay a little bit extra to have that offset paid for in the form of, some climate change initiative of your choice. I don't know, saving parts of the Amazon, replanting trees somewhere, something that would offset your carbon contribution to the atmosphere. And so you're seeing all of these initiatives all over the place in terms of corporate social responsibility in a very short period of time. Now, we've got a long ways to go. I'm not suggesting it's all sweetness and light or anything like that. Got a very long ways to go. But in many ways, our consumer preferences, our choice, our demand that the firms we purchase things from behave in a more corporate or a more socially responsible manner has transformed the way businesses think about their supply chains, how they source the materials, what's going on, where those materials are being sourced, all the way to your decision to purchase those products. And that has changed. It's been a sea change just in a short period of time where we've seen some of this activity take place and some of these demands being made of firms. And so I think to the good, and more of us are thinking in these terms about sustainability, but you're seeing firms become more astute, more conscious of it because they see you as consumers, they see you as the future of their firm's future because you're going to purchase their goods, and they want to buy your loyalty in a sense by asserting and proving to you that the products you buy are being produced in a sustainable manner. Okay, it's a big change, and so you don't have to read those two economist pieces at great length. The bits and pieces that I think are worthwhile are highlighted there, but the main thing is just in that 3-year period, you saw a pretty rapid shift in the way in the way a magazine like The Economist wrote about the utility and importance of corporate social responsibility. Changed dramatically. And now, the lid's off because that's all that in many ways we hold firms to account on the basis of what they're doing in terms of corporate social responsibility. And so I just draw your attention to that and invite you to look at those things that are posted there on eClass because I think they're really quite interesting. And I think the last one, we got 1 minute. I'll scroll down here. There's a piece here by Chris Arnott and Sean Cash, Peter Boxhall and Sean Cash. These guys were U of A professors, and what they did is a really interesting piece about fair trade coffee and our willingness, our price sensitivity to buying fair trade coffee over some other kinds of coffee, a kind of metric of or a sense of our own commitment to the corporate social responsibility. They took a bunch of funding, research funding, and they manipulated the coffee prices at the Cram Dunk in Sub, the coffee place in Sub, by the bookstore, and they manipulated the coffee prices for like 2 weeks, and to try to test what people's propensity was to purchase coffee that was fair trade, a little more expensive versus not. And the results are really interesting because even students have a fairly strong propensity to buy fair trade coffee, even as the prices go up, because of the sense that we're purchasing something that is sustainably harvested, sustainably produced. And so it's kind of a test of that, but a little local content there for you if you want to skim that one too. So at any rate, that's all I wanted to say today. I wanted to make sure we got through a little bit of that and sort of throw some of this stuff at you for you to chew on. And so I think did an okay job. Any questions before I sort of shut this down and bid you all a happy weekend? Yeah, Georgia, go ahead.
So I know you spoke specifically about like corporate social responsibility in terms of um, consumers' preference for like sustainability.
Yeah.
Um, I guess I'm trying to think of how to phrase this best. Sorry. Um, do you think that might be applied to beyond just that? I'm thinking specifically of the Black Lives Matter protests this summer, and there was sort of a call on companies to put out statements about that. So, do you see that moving beyond just sort of the product themselves and into the companies?
Yeah, I mean, whether that particular issue catches fire or not, I think we are all demanding a kind of we're demanding that the firm become different, that multinationals do things differently, and that includes even in their home countries. We've been outraged for a long time. When we discover that multinationals are up to no good. Canadian mining firms are putting the boots to workers in Peru or something like that. We've always gotten upset with that. But we're demanding this kind of responsibility and social activism, I guess is what I would say. So as you were talking, the example that comes to mind are the ways that investment banks have been pushed, like JP Morgan, for example, have been pushed to extend their reach and into poorer neighborhoods, what they call the unbanked neighborhoods where traditional finance has kind of abandoned ship because they don't think there's any money there and they can't make any profits. And instead, what they've been pushed to do is to actually extend their reach into some of these places, including microfinance schemes and so on, to try to show that they would like to see parts of Detroit redeveloped and not look like a kind of hollowed out industrial wasteland. People live there, and so J.P. Morgan has a responsibility if they're going to make money through mortgage loans and so on in that city. They have an obligation to also engage in socially responsible or constructive activities in the communities in which they operate. And so there's been tremendous pressure on lots of firms to do that, and they're called out when they don't. And so, had they gone far enough, to your point, exactly around sort of Black Lives Matter and what the corporate view is on policing, those are questions that every firm is going to have to wrestle with. But the change has, in my view, been kind of breathtaking when you look at decades and decades of inaction and the firm just saying, we're here only to make profits for shareholders. They're now doing all of these things that aren't about shareholder profit alone. But in a sense, they are kind of shoring up their own bottom lines, because you and I look at what they might do, say around Black Lives Matter, or engaging in activities in communities that are underserved. We might say, you know what, I like what Chase Manhattan or J.P. Morgan is doing in hollowed out Detroit and in parts of Detroit. I like what they're doing there, so I'm gonna invest in them, or I'm gonna allow my portfolio to hold a bit of that stock. And so it feeds on itself. So it's in a sense, we have demanded it, but it also feeds their bottom line to respond to us because it draws us in. We purchase their products, we buy their shares. And so I think there's a symbiosis. I hate those kinds of words, but there's a kind of symbiosis there in that. And I do think it's been driven by our demand, our sense of you can go back to the environment, the origins of the environment movement and how, unsustainable harvests of the oceans, or cutting down trees. You might be able to pinpoint some of this to those movements, in the 70s, for example. But they have evolved such that we are all very socially aware, because we can go online and see all the injustices that take place. All you need is a cell phone and a video, and you can expose horrific conditions in gold mines or diamond mines in South Africa. That's another very good one, by the way, is if anyone you want to look it up, is the Kimberley process, they call it. And it's really about conflict diamonds, they used to call it, where all the raw diamond diamond rings that were sold in jewelry stores, a lot of that was funding civil wars. The way it was being mined, De Beers and some of the other big diamond conglomerates were getting these rocks in very unusual ways, and the financing of the purchase of those things was basically fueling genocide in some countries. And so when those diamonds eventually got to rich countries where, couples in love would go out and get, get a diamond ring. In a sense, we were funding in the purchase of that, we were funding a civil war somewhere. And so that has changed quite dramatically as well, where the Kimberley process supposedly certifies that those diamonds are not being harvested and the proceeds are not going to fund civil conflict or corruption in the countries in which they are mined. And so now all of those supply chains are much more transparent. And we can argue about whether or not they're transparent enough, of course, but all of that has changed in a relatively rapid period of time. And I would credit just the proliferation of, not much goes unnoticed these days because everybody has a cell phone. And so we can all, we clicktivists can all get really excited, but there are consequences. And I think the example of Loblaws, the Canadian example of Loblaws that's there in that Fifth Estate piece, really drives that home in terms of changing practices, forcing changes on corporations because we demand it. We're not going to go and buy that stuff if we can't be sure that the people that made it have a living wage or have decent working conditions. And so those are big changes. Those are really big changes in terms of what we demand of our companies, the companies we buy stuff from. That's a long-winded answer, Georgia, but it's a very good question. And where it goes is anybody's guess. I think it depends a lot on our preferences as consumers and the kinds of demands that we make on the firms that we deal with, whether through investments or through our consumer behavior. Excellent. Anybody else? I don't have anywhere to go. I'm going to watch another episode of The Crown tonight. Recommend that one. Been pacing myself, but darn good show. So that's what I'm going to be doing this evening. If nobody else has any there is one question here in the chat. I'll have an answer. Okay, so the question is, we have like one more Wednesday before the end of classes. I will look at eClass. So how much more material are we going to get through? I'll look at eClass and see what we got left to do. And I'll let you know over email, and also sometime this weekend, I'll let you know what's left that I'd like to cover. Not a whole lot, actually. This kind of puts a little bow on a lot of things that we've been talking about. But it'll probably be, because we're dealing with the environment in the context of the WTO simulation next week, we probably won't touch on that. There's lots of videos on that I would have covered anyway. Maybe do a little bit of debt and development. I think that's an issue that a lot of people are interested in. So we'll talk a little bit about things maybe like the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. So there'll be at least one more session next week, but I'll tell you what material and be very clear about what's left to cover. All right. So good question, but I'll make sure you all are up to speed on what that is. All right. Excellent. Okay, well, thanks to the small number of you that spent part of the afternoon with me, and hopefully didn't muddy the waters too much. And I hope you all have a very good weekend, and we'll chat with you again soon. All right, take care. Have a good weekend, everybody.